Hi, this is Rima, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects. In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world. Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. What role did Kurdish women play in Iran's protests last year? The death of Jina Mahsa Amini at the hands of Iranian authorities sparked mass demonstrations for women's rights under the rallying cry of women, life, freedom. But the Kurdish minorities behind this resistance have largely been erased and their movements co-opted before the international community. In this episode, we speak with Rez Gardi, a Kurdish New Zealander lawyer and human rights activist, about how, despite becoming the symbol of a revolution, non-Kurdish activists and news coverage have continually denied Jina her true name and identity. We talk about the long-lived Kurdish resistance against state oppression in Iran, Syria, and Turkey, and the broader history of the Kurdish struggle for autonomy and self-determination in the Middle East.
The following is a PSA from the University of Chicago's Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, presenting the Pearson Global Forum. A thin line divides human realities. The fundamental desire for simple human existence remains the same, yet reality is dramatically disparate for many. Join us on Friday, October 20th to hear from global experts as they discuss the topic of disparity and how it impacts people around the world in places like Iran, Afghanistan, and Mexico. This in-person and virtual event is free and open to all. You can find more information at thepearsonglobalforum.org. Thank you.
My name is Zerine, a Master's of Public Policy student, and I also went to Indiana University.
And I'm Hannah. I'm a first-year Master's of Public Policy student and Pearson Fellow here at the University of Chicago.
And my name is Rima. I'm the producer of Root of Conflict and a student at the University of Chicago.
Thank you so much for being here, Rez. Really appreciate having you here. So, could you introduce yourself a little bit? What do you do? Your background? I know you were born as a refugee and now in New Zealand, the first Kurd to graduate from Harvard Law. So for our audience, can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Zareen. It's a privilege to be here today talking to you all. Exactly as you mentioned, I was once a refugee with dreams, but now a Harvard-educated lawyer fighting for the rights of minorities and marginalized groups globally. So I would describe myself as an international lawyer with a key focus area in human rights, international criminal law, and refugee law. To me, even working as a lawyer is really much related to my history and my identity, and where I was born. I didn't choose to be a refugee. I was born as a refugee in a refugee camp in Pakistan. And so those experiences from a very, very early age in refugee camps, such as the unpredictability of life and constant threat of danger, not having access to basic human rights, the mass protests, people dying from diseases from hunger strike, witnessing authorities abuse peaceful protesters, and having my own father and our friends and family members imprisoned for advocating for human rights gave me an insight into what these issues were, learning about the denial of human rights long before I knew what those concepts meant legally. So big intersect between my identity as a Kurdish refugee and why I am now a lawyer specializing in human rights refugee law.
Thank you. So to get into the Kurdish issue, the focus of our episode today is the role of Kurdish women in Iraq's feminist revolution, Mahsa Amini. But before we get into that, can you just give us, our audience, a brief introduction on what is the Kurdish issue?
The history and geopolitics of the Kurdish people is really complex and harrowing. And I think to understand what's happening currently in Iran, it's important to understand a little bit about the Kurdish people's struggle in order to make sense of why Kurds are facing the issues that they are today and why this contributes to the work that we do and our identity formation in the diaspora and the advocacy work that we collectively do in pursuit of the plight for human rights. I mean, of course, we can't cover the entire history because it dates back 100 years. But if I'm give just maybe a quick summary of how we got to be here. So in this geographic region where the Kurds form a prominent majority in what we call Kurdistan, Kurdistan encompasses the area from the southern end of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and the northern Zagros and eastern Taurus mountain ranges. Kurds who are of this Aryan descent are an ethnically unique group, distinct from the neighboring Arabs, Persians, and Turks. Today, Kurdistan is divided amongst four countries predominantly, and there are bits elsewhere, but for the focus of this, we'll focus on these four. So northern Iraq is what we call southern Kurdistan or Bashur. Southern eastern Turkey is what we call northern Kurdistan or Bakur. Northwestern Iran is eastern Kurdistan or Rojava, and then the northeastern Syria, which is western Kurdistan or Rojava. A majority of the struggles that face Kurds today date back about 100 years ago and can be traced back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was drafted at the end of World War One. This was a secret document negotiated by a British officer, Mike Sykes, and French diplomat Francois Georges Picot, and it was ratified by France and Britain in 1916, essentially splitting the region into two spheres of influence after the end of World War, and really changing the map of the Middle East. Following that, in 1920, the Ottoman Empire and the United Kingdom drafted the Treaty of Sevres, which would have assured Kurdish independence and allowed Kurdistan to have somewhat of its independent land. However, Ataturk's victory at the Turkish War of Independence barred the ratification of the Treaty of Sevres, and the Allies reneged on the promise of this Kurdish independence. So in 1923, the Treaty of Sevres was nullified, and the Treaty of Lausanne superseded that treaty, and this treaty contained no reference to Kurdistan. So essentially, the region was split really indiscriminately without thought much to the different ethnic groups, the religion, the different divides that existed into four newly emerged states. So it's Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Persia, now Iran. This has created issues for millions of minorities and stateless ethnicities that straddle these makeshift borders, really created about 100 years ago. And for Kurdish people, an independent Kurdistan has long been the dream of Kurds. Kurds are estimated to be approximately 25 to 40 million. It could be much more because, as we know, that these countries don't really allow the census or take statistics to understand what the true population really is. But by estimates, up to 40 million or more are the world's largest ethnic group without a state. Kurdistan remains divided by these repressive colonial states who have stifled any attempts by the Kurds of securing freedom against domination and their struggles for a recognition of their minority rights. So the Kurds have endlessly faced oppression, discrimination, assimilation, ethnic cleansing, and genocide at the hands of these oppressors. The Kurds are one of the most persecuted minorities of our time, and until very recently, it was illegal to speak Kurdish in Iraq, in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, and all vestige of Kurdish existence was banned. So just to set the scene, policies towards Kurds have been described as ethnocide and linguicide, referring to deliberate acts that aim at the extinction of the Kurdish culture and language. So that is the context that we're talking about before we, try to understand what is happening to the Kurds in Iran. People need to understand that this history dates back. It's not something new, but it is being exacerbated right now.
Going into Mahsa Amini's death and the protests in Iran, what is the importance of recognizing Mahsa's Kurdish name, Jina?
Well, if we speak about the Iran specific, so what I've mentioned happens across the Kurdish regions. In Iran specifically, there are estimated about 8 to 12 million Kurds in the Kurdish region of Iran. The majority are located within these five provinces that we call Rojhelat or Eastern Kurdistan. Um, and this history of Kurdish activism or revolution in Iran, I think is important to also understand as to why things are the way they are for Kurds in Iran currently. So, um, in 1946, Kurds established the Republic of Kurdistan in Mahabat. Mahabat is the capital of Rojhelat, Kurdistan, and it has significance in Kurdish history as a site for past and current Kurdish-led revolutions. It was founded by the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan under the leadership of Qazi Muhammad, who became the president. It was an independently governed state in the Kurdish inhabited territories of Iran. However, the Republic of Kurdistan was overthrown by the Shah of Iran, then Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, within a year. So bringing the end to the Kurdish state before it even reached the first anniversary. The leaders of the Republic, including the legendary Qazi Muhammad, were all arrested and hanged for treason, and that treason was their fighting for Kurds' legitimate right to self-determination. So while the Republic of Kurdistan was short-lived, it's an important historical precedent for the Kurdish quest for independence and demand for Kurdish rights um, within Iran. And there's been a history of oppression against Kurdish minorities in Iran. The Kurds were instrumental in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which saw the overthrow of the Shah. However, upon securing his leadership, the Ayatollah Khomeini soon turned against the Kurds because they were demanding human rights, democracy for Iran, and regional autonomy for Kurdistan. And Khomeini announced a fatwa calling for jihad against the Kurdish dissidents led by the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, which was Dr. Qassemlu. So after um, the PDKI was defeated in 1984, Dr. Qassemlu went into exile in France, and he was murdered in 1989 by agents of the Iranian regime during peace negotiations in Vienna, Austria. So dating back to this, Kurds have continued to be targets of the Iranian regime. They're economically, socially, and politically disadvantaged and discriminated against. Throughout history, Kurds have suffered this linguistic and cultural genocide in Iran. And so Jina Amini's name is another example of this. In this situation, following the brutal murder of Jina Amini, we saw her trending under a name her family and friends never used for her. And this was because she was not allowed to use her own name in her life. And she's even being denied that name after her death. As Kurds living in Iran, her parents were prohibited from registering the name they had chosen for her. Instead, they're forced to choose from a list of permissible Persian or Arabic names. So Kurdish names are banned entirely in Iran. They chose Mahsa for official purposes, but she didn't go by Mahsa and her family and her friends. Her name was Jina Amini. And so Jina Amini has become the symbol of the revolution, yet the majority of non-Kurdish protesters and organizers are still refusing to call her by her name and continue to use the name that was forced on her by the regime, Mahsa. The irony here is that the revolution is about human rights and toppling this regime, yet most of the people leading the protests who are non-Kurdish are still refusing to use her name. So the first thing that we need to be doing here is asking ourselves why is there this refusal to use her name? What kind of policies are being continued by denying her Kurdish name? And if we really believe that this is a revolution about human rights, then we need to be using her name if she's become the symbol of the revolution. So this is, the importance of her name. I've raised this with many influential human rights activists and organizers, campaigners, and for the most part, some of the responses have been really inadequate. For example, some saying they were not aware that this is her real name, or that the name is commonly used. And I think the not being aware is something related to education, which we can only educate. But when it comes to the second part, where the justification is that it's commonly used, this is a really dangerous rhetoric, because the common usage of Jina Amini should not be a justification to keep using her name, but actually should serve as a really powerful reality check. As marginalized minorities, Kurds do not have the same platform, influence, network, or power that perhaps other groups have. And so the fact that Mahsa Amini is being commonly used in these circles indicates that Kurdish people don't have the influence, or are not present within these groups, or are not being given the platform, because Mahsa Amini is not common usage within Kurdish populations. So that it's common usage in these networks indicates that there isn't being a sufficient attempt to include the voices of minorities in these platforms that we're seeing predominantly in the West.
So, Rez, I'm a little curious. How much, like you said, ignorance and lack of education definitely plays a part, but how much do you think this is repression by just Iranian media sources? Do you think, again, this sounds a little conspiracy, but do you think there is repression from this advocacy, the advocacy of surrounding her name and the linguistics being spread out outside of Iran?
Look, I think we can't dismiss entirely that there is a strategic element to this, that that there are some advocacy strategies that's being prioritized over the voices of minorities. And just to be clear, it's also other minorities in Iran, not just Kurds, but for example, there are approximately 1 to 2 million Baluch minorities in Iran who are also being left out, having their voices erased from their role in the revolution, and also being indiscriminately targeted disproportionately by the state. I think there are important factors to consider here about the role of Kurdish women, and now what we see as a almost complete erasure of their role. Jina Amini was a Kurdish minority. We've already established that. But what is often not talked about is that it was at her funeral, at her Kurdish hometown, where the protests were first started, and that triggered protests that spread nationwide. There's been a history of oppression against Kurdish minorities in Iran. It was the Kurdish provinces that exploded into protest after Jina's death, which for many Kurdish people symbolized an unbroken cycle of oppression by the Iranian regime. According to human rights organizations such as Hingal, that tracks human rights abuses in the Islamic Republic, prior to the protests, 128 Kurds died by direct fire or baton strikes in the previous year, while 52 Kurds were executed in Iranian prisons, and about 7,000 Kurds were arrested by Iranian security forces. So Jina's death was the final straw for Kurdish minorities. It wasn't an isolated incident, but it was a series of events that had kept occurring against Kurdish groups that triggered these protests, which started at her Kurdish hometown, Sakaz. So it's important to understand where and why the protests first erupted, and then also the slogan of the movement, and where that comes from, the history of that. Xinjiang Azadi has been a slogan of the protests in Iran, and it's been for the most part translated into English and Farsi, which is not a problem. Translations are important so people can understand what it means. But when it is being translated without the Kurdish words still remaining, or without the history of the Kurds, that's when it becomes problematic. Xinjiang Azadi is a slogan of the Kurdish women's movement, Women Life Freedom, which was born in the mountains and villages by the guerrilla group, the Kurdish Workers' Party, or the PKK, who have been fighting against the Turkish government. It is rooted in anti-colonial, anti-imperialist ideology, and it has a very long history that is not being acknowledged at all when the media and different organizations and protesters are using this term. As I mentioned, when it becomes problematic is that when the translation and the co-option is taking place without any regard to its history, and it's predominantly done so by Persian elites, this is when it's a symptom of the erasure of Kurdish identity and culture. It's being stripped of its historical and ideological significance, which is extreme left wing. So it doesn't align with some of the elites that are also co-opting the phrase for their movement. Because as I mentioned, it's born in the villages and mountains of the movement in Bakur, Kurdistan, and has a very left wing ideology. So when it's been co-opted and rebranded as an Iranian phrase, the irony is that currently the Kurdish language is banned in Iran. At the moment, the Kurdish language is being suppressed in Iran and Kurdish schools are forbidden. Several women around the same time have been arrested for teaching Kurdish lessons. So the irony couldn't be more, stark when you're using a Kurdish phrase while Kurdish is banned.
And it just seems to be, even in regards to the protest, even that seems to be something that's been co-opted. It seems, from what you're saying, it sounds like it was originally a protest for Kurdish people and their frustrations from just constantly being oppressed, and now it's just snowballed into a women's protest. Not that that's not important, but it seems like that even in this protest, the importance of Kurds and Kurdish issues, even that's being erased or forgotten.
Exactly. And what I think is also frustrating, and I've heard from many Kurdish women that I've worked with who have fled Iran recently, on the border of Iraq and Iran, working with women who have directly been involved in these protests and have had family killed at the hands of the regime, had family arrested. They are the ones saying, this revolution is not just about headscarves. When did it become just about headscarves and whether we free our hair or don't free our hair? This revolution is about democracy. It's about overthrowing a dictator regime. It's about structural change. And somewhere along this, it's become just about whether women are, should be allowed to wear the headscarf or not. And of course, this is important. I am a strong feminist and believe in women having the right to wear a hijab or not wear one as they please. But the frustrating thing for a lot of these women and Kurdish minorities is that it's become just about the headscarf when actually it's supposed to represent something much bigger, something more structural and systematic in the way that people are treated in Iran. And also what has been illuminated to me by some of these people who have the biggest stakes in the outcomes of this revolution is that in the media platforms and so on social media at high scale, high level events, whether they're in Europe or the US or other parts of the world, it is some of the most prominent Iranians who have been speaking about the issues. And the ones who are predominantly being given platform are pro-Shah supporters who fled when the Shah was ousted, and now they're advocating for the former Shah's son to come to power. And the way that they're expressing their frustration to me is that there was a reason the Shah was overthrown, and that just because his successor did not turn out to be what the people expected, i.e. the Islamic Republic and the Ayatollah did not carry out their promise of freedom and democracy and better rights for Iranians. Just because that did not happen does not justify bringing back the previous regime and going backwards. For a lot of these people, simply removing the Iranian Islamic regime and replacing it with another authoritarian government will not solve anything. For this reason, many Kurds believe that the son of the former dictator, the Shah Pahlavi, is not a viable alternative, and that there actually needs to be a true democracy, a government that upholds the rights of all people in Iran, including these significant numbers of Kurdish and Baluch minorities, and that it is about structural change. As one Kurdish woman whose name I shall keep confidential for her safety stated to me, we don't want to just go on without headscarves. We need to be recognized as human beings and have the same rights as other human beings in democratic countries.
Yeah, I mean, building off of that, how do you feel that the Kurdish women's, how do you feel about the Kurdish women's role in the protest movement? And as your own experiences as a Kurdish woman and human rights advocate, what are your insights on the challenges facing Kurdish women in Iran and the wider Middle East?
In what's been happening in Iran, we can see from a lot of the media attention that it's getting that a lot of the protesters are actually young, really young women predominantly, but a lot of young men supporting this movement. And so the demographic of these protesters is very young, which I think is a very important to think about. And then when it comes to the rights of women in the Iranian regime, we know that the Iranian Islamic Republic has suppressed women's rights for the large part. There has been a lot of denial of their rights when it comes to access to public space, when it becomes access to education, when it comes to expressing their voices in the political sphere. They've really been denied that. For the most part, women have been suppressed across Iran. But this is even further exacerbated when it comes to this intersectional approach of Kurdish women. And so we see a stark difference between the lives of Persian women in Tehran, for example, in the capital, and the way they're able to live their lives compared to women in the Kurdish regions or women in the Baluch regions. There's a large disparity when it comes to that. When it comes to the response by the government, the Iranian government's response has disproportionately targeted Kurdish cities with a full-blown military response, and there's been a systematic targeting of Kurdish identity minorities. Government security forces have responded with deadly, uncompromising force, killing protesters, and a lot of these protesters have been women and young children. 3 key tactics have been used by the government to crush the protests: the use of live ammunition by security forces, targeted arrests, and the shutdown of internet service. But despite the intensifying violence by the government, we know that protesters are still heading to the streets. And for some, this crackdown has only made them more determined and emboldened to keep resisting this dictatorship. The Kurdish cities have been under heavy surveillance, heavy military presence, and daily police checks. There's been anti-Kurdish propaganda everywhere. And more terrifying still, because of the role of Kurdish women and the role that they have played in the protest movement. They are now the focus of a harsh government crackdown. The regime has been putting more pressure on Kurdish girls and women everywhere, in the malls, in the bazaar, at school, and the university. So there's this relentlessness to target Kurdish women because of the role that they've had in these revolutions. The regime has already killed and arrested many Kurdish women who participated in the protests, and they continue to target these women in their homes. There are large cases that we hear about Kurdish women being beaten, arrested, raped by security forces. And in particular, the Kurdish cities and Mahabad, which is the capital of the Kurdish region of Iran, has faced significant brutality at the face of the government, because of the role that they've played in the past and in this current revolution against the brutal regime. Because of its revolutionary history, Mahabad has been at the forefront with intense anti-regime protests, but also has been a significant target by the government in response. The protests in Mahabad, for example, few months ago at the funeral of Ismail Mauludi, a Kurdish protester killed by the regime, where large crowds joined the funeral procession as it moved towards the center of the city. They were chanting, Kurdistan, Kurdistan will be the graveyard of fascists. And they were chanting death to the dictator, a reference to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Iranian forces in response have been implementing major military-style crackdown in the Kurdish cities, especially in Mahabad, with armed troops and tanks deployed to quash protests. Activists have been sharing images and audio files of heavy gunfire. Human rights groups have stated that the regime's forces are conducting massacres in Kurdish parts of Iran and shooting at unarmed civilians and into their homes. And this is obviously exacerbated by the government shutting down electricity and internet whenever they want. So this is the reality in the Kurdish parts. And many Iranians across the country are being targeted and arrested and executed, but the numbers are just exceptionally high when it comes to Kurdish minorities. They're being targeted specifically by the Iranian regime.
Rez, thank you so much for bringing this to light, because in hindsight, when preparing for this interview, my focus was just the women's movement, the women's protest. But the more you enlighten us, the more I realize this is much, much deeper and essentially not that different from the genocide Saddam Hussein did to the Kurds in Iraq. A lot of what you're saying echoes and reminds me of that genocide 30, 40 years ago with the Anfal. But Rez, I'm really curious, what can the rest of the world do to support Kurdish women? We're already doing a lot. We're chanting the slogan, but we're ignorant. We just see this as, Persian women overall want to remove the headscarf. But then how can we actively participate in supporting the Kurdish women whose plights we aren't fully aware of?
I think it's really important that in these movements, Kurdish voices are given platform and amplified to understand the dynamics for Kurdish minorities, because as I mentioned, a lot of the Kurdish people, and especially young women that I was speaking to, who are on the borders of Iran and Iraq, some still in Iran, have been saying that this is not just about headscarves. It is about a systematic change. And unless we have these voices heard, I fear that people in other parts of the world will not understand what the true nature of this revolution is and what the demands are. And especially, I think, for those of us in the diaspora, it's not necessarily our role to get into the substance of what the solutions should be and who should lead, as we're not the ones that will live with the consequences. However, it is our role to ensure that voices from the ground are heard, and to give a platform to people equally, to promote transparency and accountability, and to fight for the protection of human rights for all victims. I think this is what's really important, and we need to be lobbying and advocating to human rights organizations, to event organizers, to protest organizers, and be asking questions of where are the Kurdish voices in this event that you've organized or in this protest. I saw headlines for an event recently that would be happening in Geneva, where all the speakers were from a very distinct category of diaspora. And nothing against this particular group, but when you have all the people who are represented on a panel as people who have fled during the Shah's overthrow, and who are very elite, living in Europe and the US, this represents a very small minority of views compared to the bigger Iranian context. And this is one particular view of people who've lived a certain lifestyle, had a certain reality, and their politics align one way or another. And so while it's important to give them a voice too, but we cannot have the entire panel made up of people from the exact same demographic and background. We're not seeing Kurdish minorities. We're not seeing Baluch minorities. We're not seeing people who, who have a different vision and idea for the future of Iran being represented on any of these panels and events. So right now, a lot of the movement is, I think, focusing on just one group and erasing the role and experiences of a huge, significant population that is actually at the heart of this revolution. So it's important that we take this role seriously, and in whatever platforms or networks that we have access to, that we ask these tough questions, whether we are personally affected or not. But if we care about equality, and if we care about human rights and justice, then these are questions that must be at the forefront. Kurdish women have organized and mobilized for justice and equality in so many ways across the Middle East. Kurdish women, for example, fighting ISIS on the front lines as guerrilla, Kurdish women as human rights activists, Kurdish women as politicians and members of parliament who've been arrested for simply speaking Kurdish in parliament, Kurdish women who've been teachers of Kurdish language and been arrested for simply wanting to teach their mother tongue, Kurdish musicians who are singing about Kurdish struggles through their music. They've all contributed to this fight for gender equality throughout the Middle East and globally, and are having a lot of influence on Kurdish minorities. So it's important to ensure that others around the world are also aware of what's happening. I think the only time that I've really seen Kurdish women strongly featured in the media was when we were, the Kurdish women fighters, the YPJ Kurdish women fighters, when they gained almost universal acclaim when their stories were surfaced for their participation on the front lines of the fight against the Islamic State, in particular fighting the Kurdish city of Kobani. They started, really appearing on magazine covers and newspapers around the world, and they were referred to on these Western headlines as angels of Kobani, as the defenders of enlightenment principles, and fighting for secularism and democratic values against these Islamic extremists. But it's also important to note that even in this context, the Kurdish women fighters of the Yekinin Palestina Jin, the YPJ Women's Protection Unit, gained some notoriety because of the superficially fulfilled, West's Orientalist gaze, which was craving these images of attractive young women that were fighting and battling ISIS barbarity, and there was, this almost rise to attention because these were these young women who could be, our daughters and sisters, but here they are fighting ISIS. But I think it's important that also, in addition to this Orientalist gaze and images of these young women, there was a lot of substance to this, and the force that Kurdish women have been in the fight for democracy and for freedom in the Middle East. These women represented a real shift. I think they are part of this group of women that is based on a philosophy known as genealogy, which means a science of women. A number of political parties and movements adhere to these principles, but I think they are the most known figures, these women fighters of the protection units. But on the other hand, again, this was an example where they were celebrated because of their brave and fierce battle against ISIS as women, but then the Kurdish ideology was ignored and erased. So when we were talking about these women of the YPJ, we were not talking about their ideology and their beliefs and what kind of organization and vision they have for democracy in their context. We were just talking about women fighting ISIS, and that this is what gained the headlines. And I think this is a similar analogy to be made, because even in what's happening in Rojhelat now, with this movement that Jina Amini's death started, the Kurdish ideology is again completely ignored. The Kurdish roots and the experiences of Kurds are ignored. People want to talk about the high level, but they don't want to get into the details of where it started and what kind of history it's rooted in.
Yeah, you've talked about the need or the push for a democratic change in Iran. I think one thing that was very relevant to today is, we're 6 days out of an election in Turkey, and both the HDP and PKK have put support against Erdogan or for Erdogan's opponent. And I think I want to get your perspective on the path to Kurdistan's autonomy and self-determination, and whether or not you think the election that's happening next week has any ability, will be a path forward for anything for Kurds in Turkey. And specifically, I know that especially after the earthquake in Turkey, there was a limit of support for Kurdish majority areas in terms of relief. So whether or not you think that the election could have any effect, or what the possibility would be there, and how Kurds in how Kurdistan has a path forward.
I hope that the results will mean better outcomes for people across Turkey, including Kurds. But I'm a little bit pessimistic at this stage, because I remember before Erdogan's election, people were very hopeful that he would usher in a new era for Kurds and for other minorities, because of the way he campaigned and the conversations that he was having, the interviews that he was giving. People were hopeful that he would demonstrate a change from previous regimes in terms of the treatment of minorities and human rights for all and progress for all. Unfortunately, we were very wrong about that, and so I'm just now a little pessimistic whether the same situation might happen or not. So I'm holding my tongue and waiting for results and waiting for outcomes to see if they will be in favor, and if really they would just be some campaign promises, or if really things will change for some of the most marginalized and vulnerable groups within Turkey. You've rightly pointed out that during the earthquakes, the Kurdish regions again were completely erased out of the narrative, the media, the call for donations and humanitarian assistance. Everyone referred to Turkey and Syria, but no one was really talking about the fact, the reality that this large region that connects Syria and Turkey is for the most part Kurdish regions, that those who suffered the most in the earthquakes were Kurdish regions. And so it was really, again, upsetting for Kurdish communities around the world, especially those that had family members and friends lost to the earthquakes, that again, there was nothing specifically provided or support for Kurdish regions in Turkey and Syria because of the Turkish state's exclusionary politics towards Kurdish organizations and the mainstream media politics relying primarily on state organizations. We would see well-meaning friends post lists of organizations to donate to, and most of them were organizations controlled by the Turkish state, which we knew as Kurds meant that those would not reach Kurdish regions, that the Turkish state would not allow the assistance and aid that was being provided, the donations to get to Kurdish regions if they were funneled through Turkish government apparatus. Unfortunately, but then you see people, thinking that they're well-meaning, continuously send out lists of Turkish organizations that refuse to work with Kurds. So this is also, a reality. And in that particular, situation, we were advocating for support to grassroots groups that have the capacity and know how to effectively reach the people of the region without discrimination, and really focusing on those that had a track record of assisting all those in need, not just some groups and not the others. But again, this was, an example where Kurds suffered the most in the earthquakes, and then again received the least support and aid in the aftermath of the earthquakes. So going back to this political question of what might happen in the elections in Turkey, there has been a history of government after government that is anti-Kurdish, and that suppresses Kurdish rights in Turkey. So I hope that things will change, but at this stage, I'm not convinced yet, and I hope to be proven wrong. That would be the best outcome, but I haven't seen enough indication that it will go one way or another in a way that will mean something substantially different for the reality of Kurdish people on the ground in Turkey. We see reports coming in frequently from our partner organizations about Kurdish people being targeted for things as basic as Kurdish music, for as basic as being heard speaking Kurdish. So unfortunately, the Turkish people are a victim to this too, because they have been brainwashed and to such an extent where you talk to young people, maybe 14-year-old, 15-year-olds, who will tell you that a Kurdish family is a terrorist because of the education and the brainwashing that's happened at such a young age. So they're victims too, because they have no idea that they are being manipulated to hate a group with so much passion, without having any evidence of the reason of why they should think this way or another. So it's really systematic bias and stereotyping that happens. You talk to people who should not have such strong views when they've never met perhaps someone from a Kurdish minority, yet hold these strong beliefs that all Kurds are terrorists, or all Kurds are trying to damage Turkish statehood, and these kind of sentiments that I hear often. So that to me is a reason to also feel bad for people at the other end of that. Of course, it's Kurdish people that suffer the most as a result of these biases and stereotypes, but I also feel bad for the people that don't even realize that they're being fed this propaganda and are unable to challenge it. So in Turkey, the situation, I think, is still something I'm waiting for. In terms of the larger Kurdish fight for independence and statehood, I think also is something that as Kurds, a lot of Kurds, maybe not all, I don't want to speak for all Kurds, but I know that a lot of Kurds have this dream of one day having an independent nation. And this is something that is at the back of the minds. Whether that's realistic or not is a separate conversation, but this dream, this vision is at the heart of a lot of Kurdish people. Unfortunately, the reality of that is what I think is at the current at this current stage and the way that the geopolitics are playing out and the way that the neighboring countries are, it seems unlikely in the near future. For example, in 2017, we had this historic referendum in the Kurdish region of Iraq. For the most part, the Kurdistan region, as you know, Zareen, you were there, for the most part operates as a fully de facto state. People enter the Kurdish region and unless you are thinking in very, legal, sovereign kind of state border context, you could forget that you're even in a country called Iraq, that you're actually just in this separate place called Kurdistan. The laws are from the Kurdish parliament for the most part. You're governed by the Kurdish regional government. You're speaking Kurdish to shop owners and to your taxi drivers, and people mostly don't speak Arabic unless they've specifically learnt Arabic for educational purposes, and so for the most part operates as a de facto state. But when there was this referendum in 2017, the reaction by our neighboring countries was very demoralizing, dehumanizing, and caused to lose a lot of hope for Kurdish people. The referendum was successful. There was an overwhelming vote for yes to independence for Kurds in the region of Iraq, with I think something above 90% voting for to have an independent Kurdistan. It was a non-binding referendum, but just even the taking place of this referendum triggered the Turkish state and Iranian state to extreme responses. We had Turkish fighter jets flying around the region as a warning to say, you take a step in this direction, you'll see what happens next. You had Iran kind of doing the same. Iran and Turkey, in one way or another, constantly have some sort of attacks on Kurdish soil under the guise of fighting terrorism or fighting this and that, but they're always on Kurdish soil in one way or another. But in this instance, it was this direct threat saying, you take one step further towards this referendum and the repercussions will be severe. So when you're operating under that, with a non-binding referendum, and nobody had done anything further than that, it was clearly stipulated as it being non-binding, and then the reaction is that severe, you can only imagine what would happen if Kurdish groups start actively trying to pursue independence or work towards self-determination. The responses from the neighboring countries would be severe. And I'm not leaving Syria out of this, because despite going through a civil war, they still have time to attack Kurdish minorities.
Thank you so much for all this insight, Rez. It's completely changed the direction that we were going to take this episode. We just learned, just amongst us, we've learned so much. So thank you, Zorspas. As we're wrapping up this episode, what is something that you want the audience to hear? What is something that a lot of what you shared in this episode we did not know about? But is there a message that you want to share?
I think the important message that I would share with the audience is not just related to the Kurdish people's struggles. Of course, Kurdish people are one of the largest minorities around the world without a state of our own, but this applies to groups around the world. I just urge people in any conversation or discussion about a particular situation to ask who is missing from this conversation, whose perspectives are we not hearing, whose struggles are we not capturing, because and there's a good saying that, and I can't remember its origin right now, but the quote says something like, there is no such thing as the voiceless, only those who are intentionally being silenced. So I just urge people in whatever work that they're doing regarding whatever group of people, wherever in the world that they are, to constantly and consciously ask this question, because I think 9 times out of 10, when you're talking about a situation, there is there is a large group of people who are not being heard, and their experiences are being completely erased from the conversation. So we just need to ensure that we are not perpetuating their erasure through the way that we ask the questions and through the people that we invite to the conversation while leaving others out. It's not going to be perfect, but I think as long as we constantly keep asking these questions about any situation that's unraveling, and that we're trying to get the perspectives and plights of as many groups as possible, then we can support those groups from having access. We don't need to be their voices. They already have voices. We just need to ensure that we're including them in the conversations and giving that platform. And as people such as yourselves and some of the people that may listen to this podcast, I'm sure have wide networks and are affiliated with various different institutions, organizations, governments. And so we may not think so, but actually we have a lot of power to bring others into the conversation and to share our platform.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head with that one.
I have just one final question. We've talked about ways that I think the pessimism of just the region and what the future is for Kurds. What keeps you moving forward? How do you stay optimistic, and how do you keep doing the great work that you do? I think that's how do you stay optimistic?
I think it's the people that I have the privilege of working directly with in these situations. So recently I was interviewing for one of the cases that I'm working on, young women on the borders of Iran and Iraq, people who had fled the Iranian regime because they were being targeted. And when you hear these exceptional people share these stories, and they don't even know that they're such brave figures and what kind of hope that they're giving others. They're just simply sharing the facts of what happened and what they went through and what they did as a response. But when I hear people like that in such circumstances willing to fight the most oppressive and violent regimes, the most repressive regimes, and they are still willing to fight and to continue, I think this is what motivates me, is that there are so many people in different contexts around the world who are standing up to immensely scary governments and regimes and organizations, and they do this on a daily basis. And I think this is what I remember each time that I'm feeling like, oh, the system is, so skewed in one way or another that we're never going to get the results that we want, or having one of these days where I'm really pessimistic about the outcomes or whether we're having any impact at all. I just need to remember all the phenomenal people that I've worked with and what they're fighting. It's just, what I'm doing from my end is so minuscule and tiny compared to that. And I'm like, if they can do this, I should be doing even more to support this.
Thank you, Rez. And if any of our audience are curious about you and your work, where can they find you?
I'm around, so I will be. I think people can get in touch with me via any of my social media platforms. Email addresses are fine to share with your audiences, and just with the caveat that I will be in various time zones in 1 week. So if I don't respond, it's not because I'm ignoring you, and I will get to it. But yeah, I would love for people to keep in touch, to ask questions, to continue this conversation. I hope that people have learned something new from this, and I hope that it's useful in the work and in their interest areas and what they're focusing on. I think, like I mentioned earlier, even if you're working in one particular context, there's a lot of principles and learnings and shared values that we can have across different contexts that we can build on. And I too would love to learn from the work that others are doing. And so I'm very open to people staying in touch.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Rez Gardi. This episode was produced and edited by Rima Saleh and Nashita Karun. Thank you to our interviewers, Hannah Balikci and Zareen Hussein. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit thepearsoninstitute.org and follow them on Twitter.